The card reader flashed red before I even registered what it meant. Declined. I stood there in my uniform groceries piled on the belt, my hand still holding the card like it might change its mind. 3 hours later, my father would call me 32 times. He wouldn't know yet that by then, a bank compliance officer would be showing me a screen with his signature on a wire transfer for $4.8 million of my own money. But right then, all I knew was that something in my life had just been taken from me without my permission, and I didn't yet know how far it went. It was a Saturday morning, a little past 8, and I'd driven straight from the base to the grocery store near Fort Bragg to pick up supplies for a family's support drive. I ran for deployed soldiers' spouses. I'd done this run every month for 2 years. I knew the cashier by name. I knew which register moved fastest. None of that mattered when my card came back declined. I tried a second card, declined again. I stood there a moment, feeling the eyes of the woman behind me in line, and pulled out my phone to check my banking app. The screen took a second too long to load, and when it did, my account showed a lockout notice. Every card linked to it had been canceled that morning. I stepped out of the line, apologized to the cashier, and called my father, Richard Cooper. He answered on the second ring, and his voice had none of the warmth I might have once expected from a man greeting his daughter. It was flat, deliberate, like he'd rehearsed it. "I canceled your cards," he said. "You're trained to follow orders, Hannah, not manage money." I asked him what gave him the right to do that. "From now on, you check with me before you spend anything," he said. He didn't stop there. He brought up the family support drive, called it throwing money at strangers, like the wives and kids of deployed soldiers were charity cases I'd invented to feel important. I didn't argue. Arguing with my father had never once changed his mind, not in 36 years, and I wasn't going to waste breath on it in a parking lot. "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" I asked instead. He laughed short and dry. "What choice do you have?" I hung up. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't rage, not yet. It was something colder, a kind of recognition. My father had spent most of my adult life treating my career like a rebellion he hadn't approved. He ran Cooper Development, a mid-size construction company he'd built from nothing, and he'd wanted me in it. Not the army, not deployments, not a daughter who came home from the sandbox with a chest full of ribbons and no interest in his boardroom. My mother, Margaret, had been the only one who never asked me to be someone else. Before she died 3 years ago, she'd left me an investment fund shares in the company and a trust account, all of it set up carefully, deliberately, like she'd known I might need protecting someday. My father had never said it outright, but I'd always known he believed that money should have gone to him. It was his company, his name on the building. In his mind, wealth followed bloodline and obedience, and I'd given him neither. There was one detail that mattered more than anything else, and I didn't fully understand its weight yet. During my last deployment overseas, my father had convinced me to sign a limited power of attorney, something to help him handle taxes and paperwork while I was gone. I'd trusted him. I'd been 3,200 miles away, and grateful someone was watching the details. I didn't call him back. I called Evelyn Shaw instead, the financial advisor who had managed my mother's estate for 15 years and knew every account, every clause, every signature that had ever touched our family's money. When I said my father's name, Evelyn's tone changed immediately. "Hannah, don't call him back, and don't sign anything at all." I drove straight to the bank. The branch manager recognized me before I said a word, which told me something had already happened that morning that I didn't know about. He led me past the tellers, into a small office with a closed door, and he didn't sit down right away. He turned his monitor toward me instead. On the screen was a wire transfer request. Pending. The amount stopped my breath in my chest, $4.8 million. "Your father didn't just cancel your cards," he said, his voice careful, like he was delivering news to a soldier about a casualty. "This morning he tried to move your entire trust fund." I sat down slowly, my eyes fixed on the number, and for the first time all morning I understood this wasn't about control. It was about survival, and it wasn't mine he was trying to save. The compliance officer who joined us in that small office introduced herself as Diane, and she had a folder already prepared which told me this wasn't the first time that morning someone had pulled my file. She laid it open on the desk between us like she was handling something fragile. According to the paperwork, my father had used a copy of an old power of attorney to cancel my cards, changed the mailing address on my accounts to his own office request, full control of my banking transfer funds into Cooper Development, and pledge my company shares as collateral against a loan. Each item she read sounded worse than the last, but it was the final line that made my stomach drop. In his written statement to the bank, Richard Cooper had claimed his daughter was suffering psychological instability from military service and was no longer fit to manage her own finances. I sat very still. 12 years of service, 2 deployments, a chest full of commendations, and my own father had put in writing that I was unstable simply because it was convenient for him. "There's something you should know," I said, and I kept my voice level, the same voice I used briefing junior officers under pressure. "I revoked that power of attorney 6 months ago. I have the confirmation email." Diane typed for a moment, then turned her screen toward me. There it was, dated back in January, my revocation logged and confirmed in their system, which meant every action my father had taken that morning had been built on paperwork that no longer existed. Not oversight, not confusion. Forgery, misrepresentation to a federally regulated institution, and attempted misappropriation of trust assets, stacked one on top of another deliberately. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. Something in me had gone quiet and precise the way it used to when a mission went sideways, and the only useful thing left to do was think clearly and move fast. I asked Diane to freeze every transaction tied to my father's name, revoke all access, permanently issue me new accounts and cards under fresh security protocols, and preserve every email call log and signature related to the incident for a formal fraud investigation. She nodded through each request, writing quickly, and for the first time that morning I felt something other than shock. I felt useful. This was a problem with steps, and steps were something I understood. My phone had been buzzing in my pocket the entire time, and when I finally looked, I had 11 missed calls from my father and a string of texts. "Call your father back. Don't do anything stupid. You don't understand finances, Hannah." I didn't respond. I'd learned a long time ago that silence unsettled him more than argument ever did. My father needed reaction. He needed to see the effect of his words land somewhere. Giving him nothing was its own kind of answer. While Diane worked on locking down my accounts, I let my mind go back, not to indulge in it, but because patterns don't announce themselves until you look for them. There had been years of small comments I'd let slide, questions about whether I planned to play soldier my whole life. Daniel, my younger brother, telling me more than once that I didn't need the trust money since I had no husband, no kids, nothing to protect. My father, after Mom's funeral, holding on to the estate paperwork for months longer than necessary, insisting he just wanted to make sure everything was handled correctly. I'd taken it at face value then. Grief makes people controlling, I'd told myself. I understood now that grief had nothing to do with it. Diane finally slid a printed page across the desk, and this was the moment the morning changed shape entirely. It was a draft petition. A request for financial guardianship prepared, it appeared days earlier, describing me as an unstable service member, incapable of sound financial judgment, requesting the court transfer control of my assets to my father as legal guardian. I read it twice. My name in official language reduced to something fragile and unreliable, built from lies, constructed with enough care that a judge unfamiliar with me might believe them. At the bottom of the final page was a witness signature. I stared at it for a long moment before it fully registered. Daniel Cooper. My brother, the one I'd helped with tuition when he was drowning in loans, the one whose down payment I'd quietly covered 2 years ago because he'd asked me not to tell Dad he was struggling. His signature sat there calm and deliberate beneath a document that called me unfit to manage my own life. I set the page down slowly, and Diane must have seen something shift in my face because she asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine, which wasn't entirely a lie. I wasn't falling apart. I was recalculating. Whatever this was, my father hadn't done it alone, and if Daniel had signed something like this, he'd known enough to understand what he was signing. That wasn't confusion. That was a choice. I asked Diane for a copy of the petition and thanked her for her help. She told me the fraud department would begin a formal investigation immediately, and that given the dollar amount involved, this would likely draw attention beyond the bank itself. I walked out into the parking lot with the folder under my arm, the morning sun too bright for how the day had gone, and I sat in my car for a full minute before starting the engine. Not to cry, just to breathe, and to let the anger settle somewhere useful instead of somewhere reckless. My father had spent the morning trying to make me feel small and dependent. Instead, he'd handed me a paper trail. I called Laura Bennett before I even left the bank parking lot. She'd been my mother's attorney for a decade, sharp, unsentimental, and the only lawyer in my father's orbit he'd never managed to charm. I read her the guardianship petition over the phone, and when I got to Daniel's signature, she went quiet in a way that told me she was thinking, not surprised. "I want everything," she said. "Company financials, bank records, anything with Cooper Development's name on it. Give me the afternoon." She called back 4 hours later, and what she'd found reframed the entire morning. Cooper Development was drowning. 2 luxury housing projects had stalled mid-construction. Corporate taxes were months overdue. Contractors were filing liens over unpaid invoices, and the company's line of credit was maxed against collateral that no longer held its value. My father hadn't tried to seize my trust fund out of greed alone. He needed $4.8 million by noon that day, or the company's primary loan would be called in full a default that would have taken down everything he'd built. And buried in the transaction records, less dramatic, but no less damning, were a series of payments from Cooper Development to Daniel. Not salary, not draws against future equity. Quiet transfers timed suspiciously close to conversations about the guardianship filing. I sat with that for a while, hollowing out one child's trust to save the company buying the other's loyalty to make it legal. My father had built a machine, and it required both of us to run. Laura's voice brought me back. "This wasn't improvised, Hannah. Someone doesn't draft a guardianship petition overnight. This has been in motion for weeks, maybe longer." That reframed things I'd brushed past for years. My father asking more than once if I planned to spend my whole life playing soldier. Daniel telling me almost gently that I didn't need the trust money since I had no husband, no children, nothing worth protecting. My father, after the funeral, holding onto Mom's estate paperwork for months, insisting he just wanted to make sure everything was handled properly. At the time, I'd told myself grief made people controlling. I understood now grief had nothing to do with it. This had been architecture, not impulse, and I'd been standing inside the blueprint without knowing it. At 6 that evening, my phone buzzed with a different kind of message. Not a demand this time, an invitation. "Come home for dinner. We'll work this out as a family." Laura's warning came fast and blunt. "It's a setup. He wants you back in a room where he controls the terms." She wasn't wrong, but I wanted something too. I wanted to hear them say it out loud in their own words without a lawyer's careful phrasing standing between us. I told Laura I was going. "Then you're not walking in there without protection," she said. And she was right about that too. Before I drove out to my father's house, I sat in my car outside my apartment for a long moment, running through what I actually knew. Not suspicion. Fact. A revoked power of attorney used anyway. A wire transfer for money that wasn't his. A guardianship petition built on manufactured instability. A brother's signature underneath a lie. I thought about my mother, how she used to say that people show you who they are slowly in pieces small enough to explain away, until one day the pieces stop fitting into anything except the truth. I'd spent years explaining my father away. Ambitious, old-fashioned, difficult but not dishonest. I couldn't do that anymore. I drove out past the edge of town where the roads got quieter, past the church where we'd buried my mother, past the field where Daniel and I used to ride bikes, before either of us understood what our father valued and what he didn't. The house came into view the way it always had, brick and white columns, a place that had once felt like safety and now felt like a stage set for something I hadn't agreed to perform in. I parked across the street instead of in the driveway. I wanted a few minutes before I had to walk in and be someone's daughter again, someone's older sister, someone they thought they still had leverage over. Before I got out, I turned on the small recorder Laura had given me, checked that it was running, and slid it into my jacket pocket. Whatever happened at that table tonight, I wasn't going to leave it up to memory and disagreement about who said what. If they were going to say it, they were going to say it on the record, whether they knew it or not. I sat there another moment looking at the front door I'd walked through 1,000 times as a kid, back when I still believed my father's love came without conditions attached. I understood something differently now, standing outside as an adult with a folder of evidence on the passenger seat and a recorder in my pocket. I wasn't walking in there to get my money back. The bank had already stopped that. I was walking in to find out exactly how far they were willing to go, and to make sure that when it was over, there would be no version of this story where they got to say I didn't warn them. I got out of the car, straightened my jacket, and crossed the street toward the house. The dining room hadn't changed since I was a kid. The same long mahogany table, the same china cabinet my mother had picked out 30 years ago. Except now it felt less like a home, and more like a courtroom my father had arranged in advance. He sat at the head, of course. Daniel sat to his right with his wife Melissa beside him, quiet, her eyes fixed on her plate like she already regretted coming. Across from them sat a man I didn't recognize, introduced only as company counsel, and in front of my chair waiting for me before I'd even taken off my jacket was a stack of papers. My father stood when I walked in, arms open like this was any ordinary Sunday dinner. "Glad you came," he said. "We just want to protect what belongs to this family." I didn't hug him. I sat down and looked at the papers instead. The documents asked me to confirm the wire transfer had been voluntary, to grant him ongoing control of the trust, to relinquish my voting shares in the company, to transfer those shares to Daniel, and to agree that he would manage my finances going forward. 5 requests, each one designed to make legal what the bank had already frozen that morning. Daniel spoke before I could say anything. "You don't have a family to provide for Hannah. You don't need this the way we do." I let that sit in the air a moment. My father glanced at my uniform jacket still on the back of my chair, and something in his expression sharpened. "You can give orders to soldiers," he said, "but in this house, I'm still the one who decides things." "And if I don't sign?" I asked. He didn't flinch. He mentioned the guardianship petition directly this time, no longer bothering to hide it, telling me a judge would likely side with him once they heard about my deployments, the things I'd seen overseas, how service changes people. He genuinely believed that my time in uniform would work against me in a courtroom. I didn't argue with him. I asked questions instead, the way I'd been trained to when I needed someone to hand me the truth without realizing they were doing it. Who had sent the old power of attorney to the bank? Whether Daniel knew it had already been revoked? Who had actually written the claims about my mental state? How much of my trust had already gone into the company? What exactly they'd planned to do with my shares once they had them? My father's patience thinned with each question. "I built all of this," he finally snapped, gesturing at nothing and everything. "I have every right to take it back." Daniel's composure cracked next. He admitted quietly that he'd known the power of attorney was no longer valid, but he'd trusted their father would find a way to make it work. Melissa's fork stopped moving entirely. She hadn't known the extent of it either, I realized watching her face. I pushed the stack of papers back toward the center of the table. "The bank has already frozen the transfer," I said. "Fraud investigators are reviewing the account activity. The power of attorney was revoked 6 months ago, and there's documentation proving it. Everything said at this table tonight has been recorded, and the board is meeting first thing tomorrow morning." My father's face didn't change immediately, but something behind his eyes did, a recalculation happening in real time. He recovered fast, the way he always did. "I own the company," he said. "I own this house. I own everything at this table." I stood up, and for the first time all evening, I felt the strange calm that used to settle over me right before a mission went from planning into execution. By 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, I said, "You may not own the things you think you do." His phone rang before I'd even finished the sentence. He glanced at the screen, and I watched the color shift in his face when he saw the name. He didn't answer right away. He looked at me instead, like he was hoping I'd tell him it was nothing to worry about. I didn't say a word. He finally picked up, and I heard the voice on the other end, tight and formal, identify itself as the chairman of the Cooper Development Board. My father stood, mumbled something about taking the call privately, and walked toward the hallway with the phone pressed hard against his ear. Daniel wouldn't look at me. Melissa had gone pale, staring at her husband like she was seeing something in him for the first time. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair, tucked the folder of unsigned papers under my arm, and walked out through the front door without saying goodbye to anyone. Behind me, through the thin walls of that old house, I could hear my father's voice rising sharp and defensive, already trying to explain something he didn't yet understand was already out of his hands. I got into my car, sat for a moment in the quiet, and let myself feel just briefly something close to relief. Not because it was over, it wasn't, but because for the first time that day, they weren't the only ones who knew what was coming next. The next 3 hours moved fast, the kind of fast that only comes when a plan you didn't fully realize you'd built starts executing itself. I drove straight to Laura's office, and by the time I got there, she already had the fraud team's preliminary findings pulled up on her screen. The $4.8 million transfer had been formally blocked. Cooper Development's operating accounts were frozen pending review. The company's emergency line of credit, the one my father had been counting on to cover the shortfall, was denied outright once the lender's compliance team saw the fraud flag attached to the collateral. Contractors who'd been waiting on overdue payments filed for an immediate audit. And the board, moving faster than I expected, suspended my father's signing authority effective that evening, pending the outcome of the guardianship petition his own attorney had submitted to the court's legal review desk that morning. My phone had been buzzing on the seat beside me the entire time. By the time I checked it at Laura's office, I had 32 missed calls from my father. The texts told their own story if you read them in order. "Pick up the phone. You're making this worse than it needs to be. Stop the bank, now." Then an hour later, something shifted. "Hannah, we can fix this. I need you to confirm the transaction. Don't let them take my company." And finally, close to midnight, 4 words that felt different from everything that came before them. "I'm your father, Hannah." I didn't answer any of them. I'd learned a long time ago that my silence unsettled him more than an argument ever could, and that night I let it do exactly that. It was Laura who found the detail that changed the shape of everything. Buried in my mother's trust documents in a clause I'd never had reason to read closely was a provision neither my father nor Daniel seemed to know existed. If Richard Cooper ever misused my assets, attempted to seize control of my finances, or pursued a guardianship claim against me for his own benefit, the voting shares my mother had held in Cooper Development would transfer automatically and irrevocably to me. Laura read it twice before she looked up. "Hannah, this isn't hypothetical anymore. Everything that happened today just triggered it." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. My father had spent years assuming I needed his money, his company, his approval to matter. The truth hiding quietly in a document my mother had drafted years before, either of them thought to question her, was that he'd been living off assets that were never fully his to begin with. She had seen this coming somehow long before I could have imagined it. She'd built a lock into the vault and given me the only key. By morning, I was the largest single voting shareholder in Cooper Development. I didn't feel triumphant driving to the office that day. I felt something closer to exhaustion, laced with clarity. The particular fatigue that comes after a long operation finally moves from planning into motion. I put on my uniform not because I needed the armor of it, but because I wanted to walk into that building exactly as myself. No apology for who I'd become in the years my father had dismissed as wasted. He was already in the lobby when I arrived, arguing quietly with someone from the board's legal team. When he saw me, his expression rearranged itself into something almost amused, like he still believed he held the better hand. "You think putting on that uniform is going to scare the board?" he said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. I set the folder down on the reception desk between us, papers Laura and I had spent half the night assembling. Bank records, the trust provision, time-stamped correspondence, the recording from the dinner table transcribed and flagged at the relevant lines. "No," I said, "these numbers are going to." He looked down at the folder, then back at me, and for just a moment something flickered behind his eyes that I hadn't seen there before. Not anger. Something closer to fear, arriving late and unwelcome the way it does for people who never planned for the possibility of losing. Neither of us said anything else. A staff assistant appeared to tell us the board members were already gathering in the conference room upstairs, and my father straightened his jacket the way he always did before walking into a room he wanted to control. I let him walk ahead of me toward the elevator. I wasn't in a hurry anymore. The version of me that had stood in a grocery store parking lot that morning with 2 declined cards and no idea what was happening to her own money felt like someone else entirely. Now, someone from a different chapter of a story that had already turned. Whatever he still believed about how this would go, I already knew. He had spent the night trying to reclaim control of a company and a daughter he'd never actually owned. I had spent the night discovering exactly how much power my mother had quietly left in my hands, waiting for the day I might need it. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in behind him and we rode up together in silence. The boardroom smelled like coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, and every seat around the long table was already filled by the time my father and I walked in. He took his usual chair at the head out of habit more than authority now, though I don't think he'd fully registered that yet. I sat beside Laura near the middle, close enough to watch every face in the room without seeming like I was watching at all. Laura opened with the paper trail. The power of attorney my father had used was expired revoked 6 months prior with bank confirmation to prove it. The signature on the guardianship petition matched forged formatting from an earlier notarized document. Trust funds belonging to me had been used to cover Cooper Development's shortfalls without authorization. Loans had been taken against collateral that was never legally his to pledge. Financial records had been restructured in ways that obscured where company money had actually gone. And quiet payments, several of them, had been made to Daniel in the weeks leading up to the guardianship filing. My father tried to reframe it before she'd even finished. He leaned forward, voice steady, practiced. He said he'd only been trying to save the company his wife had helped build, the company that employed people that mattered to this town. He looked at me and said I only showed up when there was money involved, that I'd abandoned the family for a uniform and come back the moment it was convenient. I let him finish. I'd learned that people reveal more when you don't interrupt their performance. Then Laura pulled up the emails. They showed something different from the story he'd just told the room. Draft language for transferring company assets into a personal account. Notes outlining how Daniel would eventually take over daily operations once the transition was settled. And a section chilling in its plainness, discussing how legal responsibility could be shifted onto Daniel if the guardianship petition ever came under scrutiny. I watched something shift in Daniel's face as the words appeared on the screen. He wasn't reading them for the first time, I realized. He was seeing for the first time what they meant for him specifically. The moment he understood that he wasn't being protected in this plan, he was being positioned to take the fall for it. He didn't wait for the board to ask him anything. He spoke first, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in years. He handed Laura his phone, text threads with our father, emails outlining how to backdate certain documents. Records of the payments he'd received exactly matching the timeline Laura had already found. And finally, a draft of a sworn statement about my mental state that our father had written for him to sign word for word, none of it Daniel's own language. He told me it would be temporary. Daniel said, not looking at me, not looking at anyone. He told me she'd be fine once it was done. The room went very still. The board didn't take long to reach a decision after that. My father was suspended from his position as CEO effective immediately. His access to company systems and accounts was revoked. An interim executive team would take over daily operations while an independent audit was conducted. The board formally referred the entire matter, the forged documents, the misappropriated trust funds, the fraudulent guardianship filing, to outside investigators. My father's composure finally broke. He stood so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor, and he slammed his palm flat against the table, shouting something about loyalty, about everything he'd built, about how none of them would exist without him. 2 members of building security stepped into the doorway before he'd even finished the sentence, and I understood watching him that this was probably not the first time someone in that building had needed to call for them. As they walked him toward the door, he turned back toward me one last time, his voice lower, now almost startled by its own volume from a moment before. "You took everything from me," he said. I stayed in my seat. I didn't need to stand to answer him. "No," I said. "I just stopped you from taking what was never yours." He didn't respond. Maybe there wasn't anything left to say, or maybe for the first time in longer than I could remember, he simply didn't have the last word available to him. Through the tall windows of the conference room, I could see down to the street below, where 2 men in plain suits stood near a black sedan waiting. Financial investigators, Laura told me quietly, called in ahead of time, in case the board's vote went the way everyone in that room already suspected it would. I watched my father cross the lobby below, flanked by security, and step out through the glass doors into daylight he probably hadn't expected to walk into that morning as anything other than a man still in control. I turned back to the table, to Daniel sitting with his head down, to the board members already shuffling papers into folders, already moving on to the practical matter of what came next. I felt no triumph watching my father go, Just a long, quiet exhale, the kind that comes after holding your breath for longer than you realized. The months after that boardroom meeting moved slower than the day itself had, the way aftermath usually does. My father accepted a plea on several counts of financial fraud rather than risk a trial. He was sentenced to probation, ordered to pay restitution, and permanently barred from any executive role at Cooper Development. Daniel, having cooperated fully with prosecutors from the first meeting, avoided the harsher penalties his father faced, though he lost more than he expected in other ways. He and Melissa sold the house they'd bought with money that it turned out had never really belonged to them. The guardianship petition against me was formally dismissed. The judge, noting in his ruling that the filing had been, in his words, built on fabricated evidence designed to strip a service member of her legal autonomy. I could have sold the company. I want to be honest that the thought crossed my mind more than once, some version of it that would have felt clean and final, cutting every remaining thread that connected me to Cooper Development and everything it had come to represent. But over 100 people worked there who had nothing to do with what my father had done. Foremen, project managers, administrative staff, people with mortgages and kids in school who'd shown up every day and done honest work for a company whose owner hadn't deserved them. So I didn't burn it down. I hired an independent CEO with no ties to my family, someone the board trusted, and I did too after enough vetting to satisfy both. We opened the books to full transparency, something Cooper Development had apparently never done in its 30-year history. We paid off every small contractor who'd been left waiting on overdue invoices, some of them family businesses that had nearly gone under waiting for money my father had diverted elsewhere. And I started something new inside the company, a vocational training program for veterans, transitioning out of service, giving them a path into construction management, the way no one had ever offered me. There was a strange justice in that, turning the company my father had used to try to control his family into something that helped other people build independent lives instead. My father asked to meet a few weeks after his sentencing, somewhere neutral, a small diner outside town neither of us had ever been to together. I almost said no. Laura thought I shouldn't go alone. I went anyway because some part of me needed to see in person whether there was anything left in him, besides the version I'd watched unravel across that boardroom table. He looked smaller than I remembered, which I suppose made sense. Men like my father draw a certain size from the rooms they control, and he didn't control any rooms anymore. "You're really going to erase me from your life over a few canceled cards?" he asked once we'd both settled into a booth that felt too small for the weight of what we were about to say to each other. "It was never about the cards," I told him. "It was about you believing you had the right to decide how I get to live." He tried briefly to return to his old defense that he'd only been trying to save the company, that everything he'd done had been about protecting something bigger than either of us. I let him finish. "I'd learned that much, at least, that some people need to say their piece even when neither of you believes it anymore." I told him forgiveness, if it ever came, wouldn't mean giving him back any measure of control. And then I laid out the terms, plainly the way I'd once laid out mission parameters to soldiers under my command. He would not have access to my accounts. He would not refer to my mother's money as though it had ever been his. He would not use Daniel to apply pressure on my behalf again. And he would never again use my service, my deployments, or anything I'd survived overseas as a weapon against my competence. He didn't argue. Maybe he understood finally that arguing had cost him everything already. A year later, I found myself back at that same grocery store near the base, buying supplies for the same family support drive that had been interrupted the morning this all began. A young military spouse stood ahead of me in line, her card falling a few dollars short, her face tightening with the particular embarrassment of being watched while it happened. I quietly covered the difference before she even had to ask. The cashier, an older woman who didn't know any of this history, asked if I wanted to check my card before running it through just to be safe. I smiled. "No need," I said. "There's only one person in control of this account." My phone lit up on the counter as I gathered my bags. A text from my father. "I started therapy today." I looked at it for a moment before typing back, "That's a start." My father once told me I only knew how to follow orders. He was wrong. The Army didn't just teach me obedience. It taught me when to follow, when to question, and when to stand my ground against someone who'd crossed every line that mattered, even when that someone shared my last name. I want to know where you think this story goes next. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. We've got incredible stories to share with you every single day, so make sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment like this one. Let's keep this journey going together.